I waited for fuel that never came, watching my vehicles stand still. Across the road, their trucks kept moving, hour after hour without pause. I sent the numbers upward, careful not to accuse the system that trained me. Each report returned unchanged, and the roads kept telling the truth. In late July 1944, 7 weeks after Allied forces landed in Normandy, the western edge of France had become a continuous zone of movement. The beaches were no longer the focus. The front line had pushed inland, but only unevenly, slowed by hedgerows, damaged roads, and German defensive positions that still held much of the countryside. Behind the Allied lines, a different kind of operation was underway, one that did not involve infantry assaults or artillery barrages, but the constant movement of supplies. The United States Army, now firmly established in Normandy, faced an immediate operational problem. Its forces were advancing faster than anticipated in some sectors, but the port facilities required to sustain them were either damaged, incomplete, or still under German control. Cherbourg had fallen in late June, but its harbor was heavily sabotaged and operating far below capacity. Smaller ports along the Channel coast were not yet available. Rail lines, traditionally used for large-scale supply movement in Europe, were destroyed or unreliable. Bridges were down, marshalling yards cratered, and locomotives scarce. As a result, the American command relied increasingly on trucks, not as a temporary expedient, but as the primary means of sustaining an expanding army. By July, the road network of Normandy carried a near-constant flow of U.S. military vehicles. They moved day and night, often without lights, following carefully marked routes controlled by military police. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, all of it moved forward by truck. Empty vehicles moved back. The flow did not stop. On the German side, this movement did not go unnoticed. Near the town of Veer, along a secondary road used intermittently by German units retreating or repositioning, Obergefreiter Karl Fischer was assigned to a field logistics detachment attached to 7th Army. His role was administrative rather than combat-focused. He recorded vehicle movements, assessed road damage, and compiled reports on supply availability. Like many German soldiers, by mid-1944, he worked under conditions of constant disruption. Communications were irregular, fuel was scarce, orders arrived late or not at all. Fischer's routine involved observation as much as paperwork. When possible, he and others in his detachment watched Allied movements from concealed positions or distant vantage points, noting patterns that might be useful to higher command. What they saw along the roads increasingly conflicted with German assumptions about Allied operations. German doctrine emphasized rail-based logistics. Motor transport was important, but trucks were viewed as supplemental, constrained by fuel consumption and road capacity. German planners understood that trucks could not, in theory, sustain a large mechanized force over extended distances without access to railheads or ports. This belief shaped expectations for Allied limitations. In Normandy, those expectations began to fail. From elevated ground overlooking a crossroads used intermittently by American traffic, Fischer observed long columns of trucks moving west to east. They were not troop transports. Most carried no visible infantry. Their loads were covered, standardized, and marked with unit codes unfamiliar to German logistics officers. The trucks were numerous, sometimes dozens passing within a short interval, sometimes more. At first, these movements were attributed to local supply redistribution or temporary buildups. German intelligence reports from earlier in the campaign had noted American reliance on motor transport, but the scale now appeared different. Fischer's initial tallies recorded more vehicles than expected for routine resupply. The pattern repeated over successive days. The trucks did not travel in the same way German convoys had earlier in the war. They moved in regulated streams, separated by time intervals, controlled at intersections by military police who enforced strict right-of-way rules. Civilian traffic was excluded. German vehicles, when encountered, were often forced to wait or detour. This level of coordination suggested centralized planning and an abundance of vehicles. For Fischer, the discrepancy became more apparent when comparing vehicle counts to known American troop dispositions. Based on intercepted communications and previous intelligence summaries, German estimates placed several U.S. divisions operating within range of the observed routes. Yet the number of trucks passing through appeared excessive even for those formations. In one report drafted in early August, Fischer noted that during a 4-hour observation window, more than 300 U.S. trucks moved through a single road segment. He added that the majority appeared to be cargo vehicles rather than troop carriers. Fuel tankers were particularly common. The report was forwarded up the chain, but like many German logistics assessments in this phase of the war, it competed with more urgent operational concerns. 7th Army was under pressure. Allied air superiority limited daytime movement. Fuel shortages constrained German counterattacks. Units were retreating or regrouping under constant threat. Still, the truck traffic raised questions. American supply doctrine, though not fully understood by German observers, had evolved in response to the unique conditions of the campaign. The United States possessed an industrial capacity unmatched by any other combatant. By 1944, it had produced hundreds of thousands of trucks, standardized for maintenance and operation. Driver training was streamlined, spare parts were abundant. Fuel, though precious, was delivered in bulk through a system designed for redundancy rather than efficiency. This approach accepted high consumption in exchange for flexibility. German planners long assumed that such a system would be unsustainable near the front, particularly under combat conditions. Roads would clog, vehicles would break down, fuel demand would exceed supply. Yet, in Normandy, the expected collapse did not occur. Instead, the road network adapted. Military police units rerouted traffic dynamically. Engineering battalions repaired roads overnight. Wrecked vehicles were pushed aside rather than recovered immediately. The priority was flow, not preservation. Trucks were treated as consumable assets if necessary. From Fischer's vantage point, this created a visible imbalance. German columns, when they moved at all, were small and irregular. Fuel rationing limited movement to essential tasks. Trucks were often immobilized for lack of spare parts. Horses still pulled wagons in some units. In contrast, the American columns appeared continuous. The contrast was not lost on German soldiers who encountered these roads during withdrawals or reconnaissance missions. Accounts from the period described the sound of engines carrying for miles, the dust clouds rising above hedgerows, and the difficulty of crossing roads without being seen. For Fischer, the administrative implications were troubling. His job was involved estimating German supply capacity under current conditions. These estimates assumed that Allied forces would soon encounter logistical ceilings. The truck traffic suggested otherwise. Yet, doctrine is slow to change, especially under pressure. German logistics manuals still emphasized rail repair as the primary solution. Commanders expected that once the Americans outran their supply lines, operations would slow, creating opportunities for counteraction. Fischer's reports hinted that the Americans were compensating for rail destruction by simply replacing trains with trucks on a scale not previously anticipated. By mid-August, as Allied forces prepared for a breakout beyond Normandy, the volume of American motor transport increased further. Roads previously considered secondary became major arteries. Traffic discipline tightened. Signs in English marked routes by color and code. From the German side, the operational problem was becoming clearer but remained unresolved. German intelligence officers lacked a framework to fully interpret what they were seeing. Logistics personnel like Fischer could record vehicle counts, but connecting those numbers to strategic outcomes was more difficult. The German army had faced motorized opponents before. It had also used massed motor transport in earlier campaigns. What it had not encountered was an enemy willing and able to allocate trucks in quantities that rivaled or exceeded the number of combat troops they supported. By the end of August, Fischer noted in his personal working log that American truck traffic appeared to be increasing even as German units fell back. This suggested that supply was not constraining movement but enabling it.
The implication was unsettling. At this stage, no official reassessment had been issued. German command still expected logistical strain to slow the Allied advance. Fischer's observations remained one data point among many, filed and forwarded amid a flood of reports from a deteriorating front. The roads, however, told a different story.
By early September 1944, the operational situation in western France had shifted decisively. The Allied breakout from Normandy had succeeded, and German forces were retreating across broad fronts toward the Seine and beyond. The pace of movement strained every element of the German command structure, particularly logistics. Units that withdrew intact often arrived at assembly points without fuel, ammunition, or rations. Others disintegrated along the roads. For German logisticians, the situation was not merely one of loss, but of miscalculation. Obergefreiter Karl Fischer remained assigned to rear-area logistics observation, now operating farther east as 7th Army attempted to re-establish supply coherence during the retreat. His responsibilities expanded out of necessity. In addition to recording German vehicle losses and fuel shortfalls, he was tasked with compiling summaries of Allied movement patterns that might assist in predicting future axes of advance. These summaries increasingly centered on American motor transport. The truck columns Fischer observed in August did not diminish with distance from the Normandy beaches. Instead, they multiplied. Routes that had once supported regional traffic now carried uninterrupted streams of vehicles. American engineers widened shoulders, laid temporary road surfaces, and marked detours with standardized signage. Where bridges were destroyed, Bailey bridges appeared within days. In some cases, traffic was diverted entirely off paved roads onto compacted dirt tracks prepared in advance. German assumptions about road capacity proved incorrect. Fischer began to notice a pattern that contradicted established doctrine. American trucks did not operate as discrete convoys vulnerable to interdiction. Instead, they moved in regulated flows, staggered in time, often with minimal spacing. This made them harder to disrupt. Air attack was less effective against dispersed traffic. Artillery strikes hit only segments, quickly bypassed. More concerning was the ratio of trucks to visible combat units. German field reports from forward units described engagements with relatively small American formations, yet Fischer's tallies showed logistical support far exceeding those numbers. Fuel tankers alone appeared in quantities that suggested preparation for sustained mechanized movement, not static operations. The implication was that American operational tempo was not constrained by immediate supply concerns. German countermeasures failed to keep pace. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of German reconnaissance units that might otherwise observe or harass the truck routes. Air support was sporadic and costly. Night movement, once a German strength, was now equally accessible to the Americans, whose vehicles were equipped with blackout lights and guided by trained traffic controllers. Rail repair efforts, the cornerstone of German logistical planning, lagged behind events. Bridges required weeks to restore. Rolling stock was scarce. Allied air attacks targeted rail lines relentlessly. Even when segments were repaired, they often served only limited local needs. Fischer's reports increasingly emphasized this mismatch. In one memorandum forwarded through divisional channels, he noted that American logistics appeared independent of railheads to a degree not previously anticipated. The phrasing was cautious, but the meaning was clear. German planning models were failing. As the retreat accelerated, Fischer encountered firsthand the consequences of these failures. At a temporary supply point near Argenton, Fischer observed German vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel, while American trucks passed continuously on a parallel road. The contrast was stark. German units waited hours for resupply that never arrived. American traffic did not pause. This disparity affected morale as well as operations.
German soldiers spoke openly about the American ability to move and supply forces without apparent limitation. Such observations, though informal, reinforced the growing sense that traditional constraints no longer applied. From an administrative perspective, Fischer struggled to reconcile vehicle counts with expected consumption rates. American fuel usage, if calculated according to German standards, should have exhausted available stocks within days, yet the flow continued. This suggested not only large reserves, but an organizational willingness to expend resources at a rate German planners considered wasteful. Waste, however, was relative. The American system prioritized continuity over efficiency. Trucks that broke down were abandoned or cannibalized. Drivers were rotated rapidly. Maintenance was simplified. The objective was not preservation of assets, but sustained movement. German doctrine, shaped by scarcity, emphasized conservation. Vehicles were repaired whenever possible. Fuel was rationed strictly. This approach, effective under limited conditions, became a liability when facing an opponent with abundant material. By mid-September, the consequences became operationally significant. German attempts to form defensive lines were repeatedly outpaced by Allied advances supported by uninterrupted supply. Units ordered to hold positions found themselves flanked by forces that had advanced along roads previously thought unsuitable for heavy traffic. Fischer's role placed him in proximity to these developments without authority to alter them. He recorded, summarized, and forwarded information. The responses he received, if any, reflected institutional inertia. Commanders acknowledged the volume of American transport, but continued to expect an eventual logistical pause. That pause did not occur. Instead, the Americans reorganized their truck operations into increasingly formalized systems. Routes were designated by color and direction. Traffic moved one way on certain roads, returning on others. This reduced congestion and increased throughput. German intelligence identified some of these routes, but lacked the resources to disrupt them effectively. Fischer observed that even when American columns were temporarily halted by road damage or congestion, recovery was rapid. Engineers arrived quickly. Detours were established. Traffic resumed within hours. The system absorbed losses without visible degradation. German failures mounted. Fuel depots were overrun or abandoned. Units received orders to destroy vehicles rather than allow capture. Administrative records were lost or burned. Fischer himself was forced to condense reporting as paper and time grew scarce. Despite this, he continued to note the disproportionate presence of American trucks relative to combat units. In one late September report, he estimated that on certain axes, the number of American vehicles exceeded German personnel in the area by a significant margin. This was not an exaggeration, but an arithmetic observation. The shock, when it came, was not sudden, but cumulative. German soldiers had expected material superiority from the United States. What they had not anticipated was the strategic willingness to deploy that superiority so visibly and relentlessly in the logistics domain. By the end of the month, as German forces approached the German border, Fischer's observations took on a new character. The question was no longer whether American logistics would falter, but how German forces could operate at all against an opponent whose supply apparatus appeared inexhaustible. The tension between doctrine and reality widened. German manuals still emphasized principles that no longer matched the battlefield. Fischer's reports reflected this gap, but they remained descriptive rather than prescriptive. He lacked both the rank and the institutional support to challenge assumptions directly. The operational problem had escalated beyond miscalculation. It had become systemic.
By October 1944, the character of the campaign in Western Europe had changed again. The rapid pursuit phase following the breakout from Normandy had slowed, not because of German resistance alone, but because Allied forces were now operating at the far edge of their established supply framework. Yet even under these conditions, American logistics did not collapse in the manner German planners had long expected. Instead, it adapted. Obergefreiter Karl Fischer was reassigned to a regional logistics coordination staff operating near the western approaches to the German border. His duties were no longer limited to observation. He was now expected to reconcile incoming reports from multiple units, estimate supply availability, and assist in prioritizing fuel and transport allocations for formations attempting to regroup. The work was methodical, constrained, and increasingly disconnected from the reality unfolding on the roads. German forces faced acute shortages. Fuel deliveries were unpredictable. Ammunition stocks varied widely between units. Vehicles were immobilized for want of spare parts that no longer existed within the system. Horse-drawn transport, once a stopgap, now carried a significant portion of the remaining logistical burden. Against this backdrop, Fischer continued to track Allied movements when possible. The proximity to the German border made observation more difficult, but it also revealed new aspects of American logistics. The trucks did not merely support frontline units, they appeared to shape operational decisions. Reports from forward observers indicated that American formations paused briefly not when fuel ran low, but when command decisions dictated consolidation. When advances resumed, they did so with full logistical backing already in motion. The supply tail moved first, establishing flow, followed by combat units. This inversion of traditional sequencing drew Fischer's attention. German doctrine placed combat units at the forefront with supply following as conditions permitted. The American approach seemed reversed, roads filled with trucks days before infantry or armor appeared in force. Fuel dumps, ration points, and maintenance areas were established in advance of major movements. The implications were clear. Logistics was not reacting to operations, it was enabling them. In mid-October, Fischer was tasked with compiling a comparative assessment of German and Allied motor transport capacity within a defined sector. The assignment was routine on paper, but its execution forced a direct confrontation with uncomfortable numbers. Based on available data, Fischer estimated that American truck density along key routes exceeded German capacity by an order of magnitude. Even accounting for incomplete information, the disparity was undeniable. Where German units counted vehicles in dozens, American formations employed hundreds. More striking was the apparent willingness of the American command to accept losses. Reports confirmed that damaged trucks were often left behind if recovery threatened the flow of traffic. Drivers transferred to new vehicles, loads were redistributed. The system absorbed attrition without pause. German logistics could not function under such assumptions. Every vehicle lost represented a permanent reduction in capability. Conservation was not a preference, but a necessity. This difference shaped outcomes on the ground. German units that attempted to delay or harass American supply routes achieved limited results. Roadblocks destroyed a handful of vehicles, but traffic rerouted quickly. Air attacks inflicted damage, but American engineers repaired roads faster than German forces could exploit the disruption. Fischer's assessment report, completed in late October, stopped short of explicit recommendations. As a junior non-commissioned officer, he lacked authority to propose doctrinal change. Instead, he framed his findings as observations requiring further evaluation at higher levels. The response, when it came, was muted. Senior officers acknowledged the scale of American transport, but emphasized expected Allied difficulties as winter approached. Fuel consumption, they argued, would increase, roads would deteriorate, supply lines would stretch. These factors were real, but Fischer's observations suggested they would not be decisive. During this period, Fischer encountered a moment that shifted his understanding from analytical to personal. While traveling between administrative points, his transport column was halted by lack of fuel. The delay lasted hours. Nearby, on a parallel road, American trucks continued to move uninterrupted in both directions. The scene was not dramatic. There was no engagement, no exchange of fire. It was simply a matter of movement versus immobility.
For Fischer, trained to think in terms of tonnage, schedules, and allocations, the underlying issue crystallized. German logistics was no longer competing within the same framework. It was operating under assumptions that no longer applied. From that point forward, Fischer adjusted his internal approach to reporting. He began to emphasize patterns rather than expectations. Instead of projecting when American advances might slow, he documented how American logistics preempted those slowdowns. This shift was subtle but significant. In one subsequent report, he noted that American truck traffic increased before major operational movements, suggesting deliberate stockpiling and route preparation. The report avoided speculation, but the implication was unmistakable. At the same time, risk became more personal. As Allied forces approached the German frontier, rear area roles grew more dangerous. Air reconnaissance intensified, administrative centers were targeted, the distinction between front and rear blurred. Fischer's movements were increasingly constrained. Reports had to be delivered by courier rather than radio. Paper shortages forced summaries to be shorter, more selective. Each decision about what to include carried weight. Despite these pressures, Fischer continued to track American truck operations. He recognized that this information, though unlikely to alter immediate outcomes, might inform future understanding. The German system, under strain, lacked the flexibility to adapt in time. The turning point for Fischer was not marked by a single order or event. It emerged gradually through accumulation of evidence and experience. The realization was not that American logistics was superior in theory, but that it operated on principles fundamentally different from those Germany could replicate. This realization carried an implicit risk. To acknowledge it openly would challenge entrenched doctrine. It would suggest that expectations of Allied logistical failure were unfounded. Such conclusions, if expressed bluntly, could be interpreted as defeatism. Fischer navigated this carefully. His reports remained factual, descriptive, and restrained, yet the emphasis shifted. Where earlier assessments assumed eventual Allied limitation, later ones documented sustained capacity. By early November, as German forces prepared defensive positions along the border, Fischer's role diminished. The system he served was contracting, focusing on immediate survival rather than analysis. Still, the roads remained active, and the American trucks continued to move. The imbalance Fischer had observed since Normandy was now undeniable. Logistics, once a supporting function, had become the decisive factor shaping the campaign's tempo and direction. For Fischer, the risk was no longer theoretical. It lay in continuing to operate within a system that could not match its opponent's scale while attempting to record that mismatch accurately.
By November 1944, the operational environment along Germany's western frontier had tightened into a narrow margin for error. The German army, no longer maneuvering freely, focused on holding ground, conserving resources, and delaying Allied advances where possible. Logistics, once a planning function, had become an exercise in damage control. Obergefreiter Karl Fischer now worked within a shrinking administrative structure. Offices that had once processed detailed supply forecasts were reduced to issuing emergency allocations. Fuel deliveries were measured in hours rather than days. Vehicle movement required explicit authorization, and many requests were denied outright. In this constrained setting, Fischer's earlier observations about American logistics took on new weight and new resistance. Senior officers increasingly dismissed detailed comparative analyses as irrelevant. The immediate priority was survival. Discussions of Allied truck capacity were tolerated only insofar as they related to immediate threats, such as predicting likely axes of advance or identifying roads to block. Broader implications were unwelcome. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. American truck traffic did not slow with the onset of colder weather. Instead, it adjusted. Fischer received reports indicating that U.S. supply units rotated vehicles more frequently, reduced idle time, and stockpiled fuel closer to forward units despite increased vulnerability. Roads were kept open through constant maintenance. Mud and frost delayed movement but did not halt it. German expectations that winter would impose decisive logistical strain on the Americans proved optimistic. Fischer's position placed him at an intersection between data and authority. He was responsible for collating information that contradicted prevailing assumptions, but he lacked the standing to challenge them directly. When he emphasized sustained American transport capacity, responses ranged from polite acknowledgement to quiet dismissal. In one instance, a senior logistics officer remarked that American abundance would eventually become inefficiency. Fischer noted the comment but did not respond. His records showed no evidence of such a collapse. The pushback was not overt. No reprimands were issued. Instead, Fischer's reports were shortened, edited, or delayed. Requests for additional observation resources were denied. The system, under strain, resisted inputs that implied structural disadvantage. The stakes, however, continued to rise. As Allied forces approached key crossings and industrial regions, the ability of American logistics to maintain momentum threatened German defensive plans. Units intended to hold positions found themselves outflanked or pressured by sustained operations supported by continuous resupply. The absence of German fuel reserves limited counterattacks to brief, localized actions. Fischer witnessed these consequences indirectly but clearly. Orders arrived to prioritize fuel for select units, only to be countermanded hours later when supplies failed to materialize. Vehicles earmarked for movement were immobilized. Personnel waited for transport that never came. In contrast, American supply movements appeared anticipatory rather than reactive. Fischer's reports from late November described truck concentrations forming days before major operations, indicating deliberate logistical preparation. This pattern suggested that American commanders planned within a framework of assumed abundance. The difference was not merely quantitative, it was conceptual. German logistics operated on scarcity, allocating limited resources to meet immediate needs. American logistics operated on flow, moving large volumes continuously to create flexibility. Where German planners sought efficiency, American planners accepted redundancy. This conceptual gap became a source of tension. In one administrative meeting, Fischer's compiled figures were questioned. An officer suggested that the numbers overstated American capacity and underestimated attrition. Fischer responded by presenting multiple independent tallies from different sectors. The discussion ended without resolution. The figures were filed, but no action followed. For Fischer, the risk now extended beyond professional frustration. As Allied forces closed in, rear area personnel faced increasing danger. Offices were shelled, air attacks disrupted movement. The distinction between analytical work and personal survival narrowed. Despite this, Fischer continued to document what he observed. His focus remained on patterns rather than predictions. He avoided language that might be construed as defeatist, yet the underlying message of his reports was consistent. American logistics retained operational coherence under conditions that crippled German systems. By December, as German command prepared a major counteroffensive elsewhere, Fischer noted a final troubling contrast. Even as German units hoarded fuel for a concentrated effort, American truck traffic along multiple fronts showed no sign of diversion or reduction. Supplies flowed steadily, suggesting reserves sufficient to absorb shocks. The implication was stark. Even significant German initiatives would face an opponent whose logistical base remained intact. Fischer's role in this period was increasingly marginal. Decisions were made at levels far above him, often without reference to detailed logistical analysis. Yet his records persisted, accumulating as a quiet chronicle of systemic imbalance. The pressure to conform, to align reports with optimistic assumptions, was present but subtle. Fischer resisted by adhering strictly to observable facts. He did not speculate, he did not argue, he recorded. As the year drew to a close, the German logistical system he served was stretched to its limits. The American system he observed continued to function, adapting without visible strain.
For Fischer, the stakes had peaked not in a single moment, but through sustained exposure to a reality that official doctrine could not reconcile. The consequences of earlier misjudgments were now fully apparent, and the capacity to respond had largely passed. By early 1945, the Western Front had crossed into Germany itself. The character of the war in the West was no longer fluid or uncertain. The outcome was not in question, only the manner and cost of its conclusion. German forces fought delaying actions, often with discipline and cohesion at the unit level, but without the material foundation required for sustained resistance. Logistics, once a background concern, now defined the limits of every decision. Obergefreiter Karl Fischer remained in service through this final phase, assigned to a reduced administrative element supporting remnants of larger formations. His responsibilities were narrower than before. There was little left to coordinate. Fuel allocations were symbolic. Vehicle inventories were largely theoretical. Much of his work involved recording losses and attempting to account for assets that no longer existed. Yet even in this diminished role, Fischer continued to observe American supply operations whenever circumstances allowed. The roads of Western Germany told a consistent story. American truck traffic remained dense, organized, and persistent. Supply routes followed predictable patterns, guarded and maintained. Forward depots appeared rapidly, often established before combat units fully consolidated newly captured ground. The system that Fischer had observed forming in Normandy now operated with mature efficiency. German attempts to disrupt it achieved limited results. Road demolitions delayed movement briefly. Bridges destroyed by retreating units were replaced within days. Fuel shortages that immobilized German columns had no comparable effect on the Americans. Where German vehicles were abandoned, American trucks bypassed them and continued. In March 1945, Fischer was tasked with compiling a final regional logistics summary before his unit was reassigned yet again. The report was routine, intended primarily for record-keeping rather than operational planning. Still, it provided an opportunity to consolidate months of observation. The document contained no conclusions, only data: vehicle counts, movement frequencies, supply intervals. When compared to earlier reports, the continuity was striking. Despite extended lines of communication, winter conditions, and ongoing combat, American logistics showed no systemic degradation. Shortly thereafter, Fischer's administrative chain effectively dissolved. Units were reassigned, disbanded, or captured. Records were destroyed to prevent seizure. In the confusion, Fischer retained only fragments of his own working notes, small notebooks used for temporary tallies, never intended as formal archives. When his unit surrendered to American forces in April 1945, the encounter itself reflected the logistical imbalance he had spent months documenting. The American troops who accepted the surrender were well supplied, rested, and supported by nearby transport. Their vehicles stood in rows, engines running, supplies readily available. There was no celebration, no commentary. It was simply procedure. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Fischer was held briefly as a prisoner of war before being released. Like many former administrative personnel, he returned to civilian life without distinction. His wartime role did not lend itself to recognition or notoriety. He had not commanded troops or fought in notable engagements. His contribution had been observational, analytical, and largely invisible. The German military institution that had shaped his work ceased to exist in its former form. Its doctrines were scrutinized, discarded, or rewritten. Logistics, in particular, became a subject of post-war study. Analysts sought to understand how an industrially superior opponent had translated material abundance into operational advantage. Within these studies, the role of motor transport featured prominently. Post-war assessments by both Allied and German analysts acknowledged that American reliance on trucks had been underestimated. The scale of motorization, combined with organizational flexibility and industrial backing, allowed the United States Army to sustain operations under conditions that would have halted other forces. Railways, once a background concern, now temporarily replaced by roads and vehicles in numbers sufficient to maintain momentum. Trucks were not merely substitutes for trains, they became instruments of operational planning. Fischer's wartime observations aligned closely with these later conclusions, though he was never consulted in their formulation. His notes, if preserved at all, remained personal artifacts rather than official sources. The quiet legacy of his experience lay not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of evidence he witnessed firsthand. German soldiers had been shocked not by American bravery or tactics alone, but by the visible presence of a logistical system that seemed to defy traditional limits. Trucks outnumbering troops were not a spectacle meant to impress. They were the manifestation of a strategic choice to accept inefficiency, redundancy, and high consumption in exchange for sustained operational freedom. For the German army, shaped by scarcity and constraint, this choice proved impossible to counter in time. Fischer returned to a post-war Germany marked by reconstruction and reflection. The roads he had once watched in wartime were repaired for civilian use. Trucks once again carried ordinary goods. The extraordinary scale of military transport receded into memory. Yet the lesson endured within military thought. Logistics was no longer viewed solely as a supporting function. It was recognized as a determining factor in operational success. Fischer's role in this understanding was indirect and unacknowledged. He did not alter policy or command decisions. He did not influence outcomes. He observed, recorded, and endured. In the end, his experience represented a broader truth of the war, that behind every advance and every retreat lay systems whose effectiveness or failure shaped events more decisively than individual acts of heroism.
If this story added clarity to an often overlooked dimension of the Second World War, consider supporting the channel by subscribing and sharing so more of these quiet histories can be documented and remembered.